Bramwell Dacre didn't knock. He walked into the Halstead stable like he already owned it, his polished boots cutting through the mud without slowing, his eyes scanning the stalls with the cold efficiency of a man calculating inventory. He stopped in front of Midnight's corral, where the black stallion stood quiet for the first time in months, and he smiled not at the horse, but at the woman beside it. "There she is," he said, loud enough for every ranch hand in earshot to hear. "Lenora Bellamy, or whatever name she's using now." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up. Thief, liar, and apparently somebody's wife. He let the word wife land like a slap. "If this is your first time here, we'd love to have you with us for the whole journey. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. And if this story already has your attention, leave a like and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach rolled into Cinder Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late June of 1888, and Lenora Bellamy arrived the way most things arrive in a cattle town, quietly, without ceremony, and already being judged before she stepped off. She was the last passenger to climb down. The driver hadn't even finished setting the brake before the men gathered near. The depot started talking. That happened whenever a woman arrived alone in a town like this. The talking was always immediate, and it was never kind. "That's Halstead's mail-order bride," somebody said. "Lord have mercy on her," somebody else answered. Rourke Halstead stood apart from the crowd, with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed, watching the coach door with an expression that gave away nothing. He was 36 years old, and looked every year of it jaw rough with 2 days of stubble, shoulders broad from actual work rather than appearance, a long scar along his left forearm that had never been properly explained to anyone who asked. He wasn't nervous exactly, but his jaw was tight in a way that suggested he'd been rehearsing something in his head for the past 3 days and had just decided to throw it out. Then the coach door opened and Lenora stepped down. She was 25. She had chestnut hair pinned at her neck that was starting to come loose from the journey, green eyes that caught the morning light with an unsettling steadiness, and features so striking that 3 men stopped mid-conversation and forgot what they'd been saying. She was wearing a traveling dress that had seen better days, carrying a leather bag over one shoulder and holding against her ribs with both arms, like it was the most important thing she owned. It was. Rourke pushed off from the post he'd been leaning against and walked toward her. He took off his hat not because he was particularly refined, but because his mother had beaten that into him before she died, and some things stick regardless. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Mr. Halstead," she said back. They looked at each other for a long moment. This was the part where the letters they'd exchanged over 5 months were supposed to translate into something real. Rourke had written carefully, saying exactly what the ranch needed, and not much else. Lenora had written back with equal economy, answering his questions and not volunteering anything beyond them. In 5 months of correspondence, neither of them had managed to say anything particularly personal, which probably should have been a warning to both of them. "You look tired," Rourke said. "I've been on a stagecoach for 11 days. "Right." He reached for her bag. She let him take it. She did not let him take the cedar box. He noticed that and didn't say anything about it, which was the first sign that he might be smarter than he looked. "The wagon's this way," he said. She followed him. The men near the depot watched her go. The talking didn't stop. The Halstead Ranch sat 4 miles north of town, and the ride out gave Lenora her first real look at what she'd agreed to come to. The road wound through scrub grass and open sky, past fence lines that needed repair and a creek crossing where the water ran shallow and brown from a dry summer. The land was beautiful in the way Montana land always is, vast and indifferent, and completely unconcerned with whatever problems the people living on it were carrying. Rourke didn't talk much on the ride. She didn't push him to. She watched the country instead, and she watched the horses they passed a team pulling a supply wagon on the opposite side of the road, a pair of geldings grazing near a broken fence line, a bay mare tied outside a farmhouse that was favoring her left front hoof in a way that would become a serious problem within the week if nobody paid attention. Lenora watched that mare until the wagon carried her past. Rourke caught her looking. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. When they pulled up to the ranch, she saw immediately that the letters had been honest about the condition of the place, at least. The main house was solid but weathered, in need of paint and some roof work above the east side. The bunkhouse beyond it leaned slightly north. The fencing along the paddock was a patchwork of old repairs and fresh breaks. And the stable large, with space for at least 15 horses, had a look about it that she recognized from her first glance and hoped she was wrong about. She wasn't. 2 ranch hands came out to meet the wagon. One was a lean, sunburned man named Cal Briggs, who was probably 40 but looked 60, with the kind of permanent squint that came from spending decades staring into Montana wind. The other was younger, barely 20, freckled, and trying to appear less nervous than he was. His name was Dewey, and he introduced himself twice because he forgot he'd already done it the first time. "This is most of the crew right now," Rourke said, climbing down from the wagon. "I had 7 men in the spring, down to 3, counting myself." He said it without apology or embarrassment, just as information. She appreciated that. "The horses," Lenora said, looking toward the paddock. "How many are you running?" 12 working horses, 4 breeding mares, and Midnight." He paused. "Midnight's the stallion. We've had some trouble with him." "What kind of trouble?" Cal answered before Rourke could. "Kind where nobody goes near him anymore," he said flatly. "Took a piece out of Dewey's shoulder in April. Nearly killed one of the mares in March. Rourke's been talking to buyers, but nobody wants a horse that's trying to kill people." "Has anyone looked at him? A veterinarian?" The 3 men exchanged a look that told her everything. The nearest veterinarian was probably 40 miles away, and this ranch was not currently in a position to pay for that kind of travel. "I can look at him," she said. Rourke shook his head. "Not today. You just got off a stagecoach. There'll be time for that later." "All right," she said. But she looked at the paddock as they walked to the house, and she could see Midnight from the gate, standing alone in the far corner of his corral. Even at that distance, she could see the set of his shoulders and the angle of his ears and the way he was holding his weight. She looked away before Rourke could catch her doing it again. That first night, Rourke showed her the house with the efficiency of a man who had not spent much time thinking about what a woman might need in a living space. The bedroom was clean, he said. He'd be in the room at the end of the hall. If she needed anything, she could knock, but he'd probably be up before dawn, so if it wasn't urgent, she might as well wait until morning. She said that was fine. He said good night. She said good night back. She sat alone in the kitchen for a while after he went to bed, the cedar box on the table in front of her, and she thought about the bay mare with the bad foot they'd passed on the road, and about Midnight standing alone in that corral, and about the feed bins she'd noticed through the stable door that were open when they should have been covered. Then she went to bed. She was up 2 hours before dawn. Stable was quiet when she walked in, holding a lantern and moving slowly enough not to startle anything. The horses shifted and breathed as she passed their stalls. She stopped at each one, really looking, in the way she'd been taught before she could even properly remember being taught. The first mare was underweight in a way that spoke of a feeding schedule badly timed to her condition. The second had an abscess on her back left hoof that had been treated but not correctly. The third was fine physically but was positioned as far from the fourth stall as the space allowed, which meant something had frightened her at some point, and she hadn't stopped being frightened. By the time she reached Midnight's corral, she'd already counted 11 things that needed attention, and the sun still wasn't up. Midnight was awake. Of course he was. He was standing at the far end of his space, ears angled hard toward her, watching the lantern with the full-body alertness of an animal that had learned to treat everything as a potential threat. She hung the lantern on the post and stood at the gate without opening it. "All right," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Let's see what you're actually trying to say." She watched him for 15 minutes. He watched her back. She noticed the way he shifted his weight every 3 or 4 minutes, always protecting the same spot along his left ribs. She noticed that he was breathing at a rate slightly elevated for a resting horse. She noticed that when she moved her hand toward the gate latch, his ears went flat not with aggression exactly, but with something closer to anticipation of pain. She'd seen that before. She knew what it meant. She took her hand off the latch. Not today, she said softly. I'll be back. She turned and walked back through the stable, already thinking about what she'd need, and she didn't hear Rourke's voice until she'd nearly walked into him in the doorway. What are you doing in here? He said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man who'd gotten up in the dark, expecting an empty barn, and found something unexpected instead, and was still deciding how he felt about it. Looking, she said. At what? Everything. She kept her voice even. Your second mare is developing a serious hoof abscess. Whoever treated it before didn't get deep enough, and your feed bins need covers moisture gets in the grain, and you'll have sick horses inside a month. Stared at her. Also, she said, Midnight isn't vicious. He took a piece out of Dewey's shoulder because he's been in pain and nobody noticed. She held his gaze. Something under his skin, along the left rib cage. His saddle sores were treated on the surface, but there's an infection beneath that nobody cleaned out. Every time someone came at him with attack, he felt it, and he reacted the only way he could. She paused. He's not trying to kill anyone. He's been asking for help the only way he knows how. The silence between them lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. How do you know all that? Rourke said finally, from standing at a gate in the dark. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't not one either. Lenora picked up her lantern. I'd like to start with the mare's feeding schedule today, if that's all right with you. I'll need access to your supply records. She walked past him toward the house. He stood in the stable doorway and watched her go, and the look on his face was something between bewildered and deeply, deeply unsettled. She went into Midnight's stall 3 days later. Rourke found out the way he found out most things around the ranch Cal told him, in the tone of a man who had already decided not to get involved, but thought someone should know. She's been in with him for 2 hours, Cal said. Hasn't screamed yet, so I assume she's still alive. Rourke was across the yard and at the corral gate in under a minute. Lenora was sitting on the floor of the stall, not standing, not holding the horse at arm's length with a rope. Sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her legs extended in front of her, with Midnight standing 4 feet away watching her with his ears half-turned and his weight evenly distributed, which was a posture Rourke had not seen from that horse in nearly 8 months. She had a cloth in her lap and a tin of something that smelled strongly herbal from where Rourke stood. There was a small dark stain on the cloth. She had already cleaned the wound. Don't come in yet, she said, without looking at him. Are you? I'm fine. He's fine. Just give him another few minutes. Rourke stood at the gate and watched. Dewey appeared at his shoulder, then Cal. The 3 of them stood in a row and said nothing. After about 8 minutes, Midnight lowered his head. Not dramatically. Not like something out of a story. He just dropped his chin slowly, the way a horse does when the thing that's been bothering it finally stops hurting quite so much, and he blew out a long breath through his nose. And then he turned his head slightly toward Lenora and held still. Lenora reached up slowly and put one hand along the side of his face. The horse didn't move. All right, she said quietly. There you are. Rourke realized he was holding his breath. He let it out. Dewey said very quietly, I'll be damned. Cal elbowed him. When Lenora finally came out of the stall, she was dusty, and her hair had come half down from its pin, and there was a streak of something across her sleeve that she probably didn't know about. She looked at Rourke in a way that was direct, without being challenging, just waiting to see what he'd say. Who taught you to do that? He asked. Something moved across her face, fast, like a shadow crossing open ground. She looked down at the cloth in her hands and then back up, and the thing that had moved was already gone, replaced by an expression that was carefully, deliberately neutral. I've been around horses most of my life, she said. It wasn't an answer. They both knew it wasn't an answer. And something in the way she said it, the slight tension at the corner of her jaw, the way her hand tightened briefly on the cedar box she'd brought with her, and then loosened again, told him that the not answering was not carelessness. Protection. He wanted to push. He'd have pushed with most people. But something stopped him, some instinct that said this particular door, right now, should not be forced. Poultice needs to be changed tomorrow morning, she said. I'll show you how. All right, he said. She went back to the house. He stood at the corral for a while longer, watching Midnight, who was now standing in the center of his space instead of pressed against the far wall. Word traveled the way word always travels in a cattle town, through wives and supply orders and men talking over fence lines. By the end of the second week, 3 neighboring ranchers had sent messages asking if Rourke's wife might come look at a horse. He showed Lenora the messages at the breakfast table, watching her face. She read them once, then set them down and finished her coffee. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "What do you want me to do?" I asked first. She looked at the window. "I'll go look at the horses," she said finally. "But I won't take money for it." "Lenora, I won't take money for it," she said again. It's not something I can explain right now. Just let me help without making it a transaction." He didn't understand, but he nodded. The first horse she went to see was a 7-year-old quarter horse belonging to a rancher named Gideon Marsh, who had decided the animal was too unpredictable to work and too expensive to feed. She spent 40 minutes with the horse and came out and told Marsh that the animal had been bitten on the left rear hip, probably by another horse, and the wound had closed over an abscess that had been causing nerve pain for months. She told him how to treat it. Marsh looked at her like she'd performed a magic trick. "How long before he's rideable?" he asked. 6 weeks if you follow the treatment. 8 if you don't." 6 weeks later, Marsh's horse was working again. He talked about it everywhere he went. Then a rancher named Aldous Fitch showed up with a mare that had lost 2 foals in 2 years and was losing condition so fast that Fitch was considering selling her to anyone who'd give him $1.50. Lenora looked at the mare for a long time, asked about her feeding schedule and her water source, and which pasture she was kept in. She asked if there were certain times of day the mare seemed worse. Fitch answered all of it, growing gradually more confused by the questions. "She's being grazed near the north irrigation ditch," Lenora said finally. "I'd want to see it, but my guess is there's iron runoff in the water source. It doesn't take much, but over time it disrupts breeding cycles." Fitch stared at her. "My grandfather built that ditch." "Your grandfather didn't have this mare," she said. The mare was moved. 8 months later, she delivered a healthy foal. Fitch brought Rourke a bottle of whiskey and stood in the yard, telling him he was the luckiest man in Montana. Rourke poured the whiskey and said nothing. But that night, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, he watched Lenora writing in a small notebook she kept for the horses she'd treated, and he thought about a woman who noticed iron runoff in an irrigation ditch, who could read a nerve injury in the set of a horse's hips from across a paddock, who had arrived in a failing cattle town with a locked cedar box and refused to explain a single thing about how she'd become what she clearly was. He thought about that for a long time. "Lenora," he said. She looked up. "I'm glad you came," he said, not the way he'd rehearsed it at the depot. Just the actual truth. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. "The poultice on Midnight Side needs to be changed again tomorrow," she said. "Will you help me?" "Yeah," he said. "I'll help." She went back to her notebook. He went back to his coffee. Outside, midnight moved quietly in his corral, and for the first time in a long time, the night sounds of the Halstead Ranch were the sounds of a place that was starting, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. Then the horses started getting sick. It began with 2 of the working geldings off their feed, moving slow, showing the dull eyes and low-hung heads that meant something was wrong in the gut. Rourke thought bad water. Cal thought the heat. Dewey didn't venture an opinion, but he looked worried, which was unsettling because Dewey looked worried about almost nothing. By the 3rd day, a 3rd horse was down. Lenora went straight to the feed bins. She pulled the grain, spread a handful across her palm, and spent a long time looking at it in the afternoon light. She brought it close and smelled it. She rubbed it between her fingers. She went very still. "Rourke," she said. He was behind her immediately. She turned around and held out her palm. "Look at the color in the center of these kernels. And smell." He looked. He smelled. He didn't know what he was looking for. "This grain has been treated with something," she said. "This isn't spoilage. Spoilage smells different. This has been introduced." Her voice was flat and steady, which was somehow worse than if she'd sounded frightened. "Someone put something into this feed." The silence in the stable was complete. "You mean deliberately," Rourke said. "Yes. Who would he stop?" looked at her face. Who would do this? She was already looking away. Her jaw was set, and her hands had stilled, and she had the look of someone who had just confirmed something they had been hoping very much was not true. "I need you to pull every horse off this feed right now," she said. "The sick ones need water and rest, and we need to get whatever they've ingested moving through their systems. The ones who haven't shown symptoms yet, Lenora." He stepped in front of her. "Who did this?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Cinder Ridge, she looked like what she actually was, a woman who had been running from something for a very long time and had just realized it had followed her here. "I don't know for certain," she said, which was true. But the way she said it made clear she had a very strong suspicion. And whatever she suspected, it frightened her badly enough that she turned away before he could read the rest of it on her face, and busied herself with the sick horses, with the focused attention of a woman who had decided for now that the horses were safer to think about than the truth. Rourke stood in the middle of his poisoned feed supply, watching his wife, and understood for the first time that whatever Lenora Bellamy was keeping locked in that cedar box, it was connected to something a lot more dangerous than a secret. Rourke pulled every horse off the contaminated feed before noon. It wasn't a clean operation. 2 of the geldings were already too sick to move without help, and getting them from the stable to the clean paddock on the north side required Cal and Dewey working together, while Lenora walked beside the worst one hand on his neck, talking to him in a low, continuous murmur that had no particular content beyond the fact of her presence. The horse moved because she asked him to. That was the only reason he moved. Rourke watched that and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. By early afternoon, they had the sick animals separated, fresh water running, and the contaminated grain locked in the storage shed until Rourke could figure out what to do with it. Cal wanted to burn it. Lenora said not yet she wanted to keep a sample. Rourke sided with Lenora, which earned him a look from Cal that said this was already becoming a pattern, and Cal wasn't sure how he felt about it. The 3 sick horses didn't get worse that evening, which Lenora said was the first piece of genuinely good news they'd had. She mixed something from her supplies dried herbs she'd been carrying in the cedar box, combined with things she sent Dewey into town to buy from the general store, combined into a tincture she added to their water in careful measured amounts. "What is that?" Rourke asked, watching her work. "Slippery elm bark. A little activated charcoal. It helps move whatever they ingested through faster and protects the stomach lining while it's working." She didn't look up. "My mother used it on horses that had eaten bad pasture." She stopped the moment she said it. The word mother sat there between them, like something that had fallen unexpectedly from a shelf. "Your mother knew horses," Rourke said, carefully. "Yes." She kept her eyes on the water bucket. She did. He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. So he let it go and went to help Cal repair the fence on the north paddock, because some silences deserve respect, and some information has to be offered freely to mean anything. The horses were on their feet by the following morning. Not recovered, not by a long measure, but standing, which was a different thing from the previous night, and it mattered. Rourke found Lenora in the stable at 5 in the morning when he came down, sitting on an overturned bucket between the 2 worst geldings, a lantern at her feet, her head tipped back against the stall post with her eyes closed. He thought she was asleep until one of the horses shifted, and she immediately put her hand on his neck without opening her eyes. "You didn't come to bed," Rourke said. "I dozed," she said. They were restless around 2. I didn't want to leave them. He stood in the doorway looking at her, the tired lines around her eyes, the hay in her hair, the complete absence of any complaint in her voice, and he thought of all the things she'd done in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived. The mare's feeding schedule, rebuilt from scratch. The hoof abscess on the second mare, properly cleaned and treated this time, already showing new healthy growth. Midnight, who was now allowing Dewey within 10 feet of the corral fence without flattening his ears. The neighbor's horses, Marsh's quarter horse, Fitch's mare, 2 others he'd heard about through Cal, all of them better. And now this, a night on a bucket between sick horses because she didn't want to leave them alone. "Go get some sleep," he said. "I'll watch them. I'm fine. Lenora, go sleep in an actual bed. She opened her eyes and looked at him. There was a long pause in which he expected an argument. Instead, she stood up, put her hand once more on each horse's neck, in something that was not quite a pat, and not quite a check, but was somewhere between the two, and walked past him toward the house. "Wake me if either of them starts going backward," she said. "I will." She went inside. Rourke sat down on the bucket and looked at the horses and thought about the cedar box, which had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days now. She never opened it in front of him. She never left it unattended in a room he was likely to enter. But she hadn't taken it back to the bedroom either, which meant something he just wasn't sure what. 10 days after the feed contamination, all 3 horses were recovering well enough that Lenora allowed herself, for the first time, to look slightly relieved. Not happy she didn't do happy in any obvious way, but the line between her shoulders eased a fraction when she checked on them in the morning, and she ate a full breakfast for the first time in a week and a half, which Rourke noted without saying anything about it. What he did say, over coffee, was, "I want to know who did it." Lenora set her cup down. "I'm working on a theory," she said. "Tell me." "I'd rather be certain first." "Tell me anyway." She looked at him across the table with the expression she used when she was deciding how much to give and how much to keep back. He'd come to recognize it. He was learning that it almost always meant she was going to give less than he wanted, but more than she'd originally planned. "There was a man in Pennsylvania," she said, "a horse dealer. Well-connected, well-funded. He had a particular interest in what I knew about horses." She stopped, chose her next words. "When I left, he was not pleased." "How not pleased?" "Enough to cause problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that followed me here," she said, and that was all she would say. Picked up her cup again, and the conversation was finished in the way that some conversations get finished, not concluded, exactly, but closed. Rourke sat with that for the rest of the morning. He didn't like it. But he dealt with worse kinds of waiting in his life, and he understood, on some level he couldn't have articulated, that pushing her on this before she was ready would cost him more than the information was worth. Pregnant mare went down on a Thursday night. Her name, informally, was Clara. Dewey had named her sometime in April, and the name had stuck the way informal names do on working ranches, gradually and without anyone making a decision about it. She was a chestnut quarter horse, 7 years old, and this was her 3rd foal. The first 2 had gone well. This one had been giving trouble since spring. She was carrying heavy and low and had been off her feed for 2 weeks, which Lenora had been monitoring carefully and which had been improving. Then she went down. Cal came for Rourke at 11 at night, and Rourke came for Lenora. And by the time they reached the stable, Clara was down on her side and breathing in the short, hard way that meant she'd been struggling for a while already and hadn't been heard until recently. Rourke took one look and felt his stomach drop. He'd lost a mare in foaling 4 years ago. He'd lost the foal with her. He knew what this looked like. "How long has she been down?" Lenora asked. She was already in the stall, kneeling beside Clara's head. "Don't know," Cal said. "I checked her at 8. She was standing." So somewhere between then and now, Lenora ran her hands along Clara's side, her face set and focused. "She's been trying to deliver. The foal is partially presented." She looked up at Rourke. "I need your hands. Clean water, as hot as you can get it. Lanterns, more light. Lenora, if the foal is... Get me the water and the light," she said. Her voice was even, not calm. Exactly not the practice calm of someone pretending, but focused in the way a blade is focused, all the weight of it going in one direction. "We still have time, but not much of it. Move." He moved. The next 3 hours were not the kind of thing Rourke would ever describe easily to anyone who asked, because there was nothing clean or straightforward about them. Lenora worked in the lamplight with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, guiding, adjusting, talking to Clara in that low, continuous murmur that he was starting to believe was as much a tool as the poultices and the tinctures, some quality of her voice that communicated a steadiness the horse could borrow when her own was failing. Rourke followed her instructions exactly, which required him to set aside every instinct he had about what to do and simply do what she said, which was harder than it sounded, because some of it didn't make obvious sense, and he had to trust her anyway. Cal stood outside the stall and didn't come in. Dewey sat on the ground outside the stable door and did not look in the direction of the stall and moved his mouth without making any sound, which was the closest he came to prayer. At 2:14 in the morning, the foal was born. It was alive. It was small and ungainly and hit the straw with its legs going in 4 different directions at once. And Clara raised her head and looked at it with the expression of a creature who has just come through the far end of something terrible and is still deciding whether the territory on this side was worth it. Lenora sat back on her heels. She had blood on her arms to the elbow and hay in her hair, and there were tear tracks on her face that she probably didn't know were there. Put one hand on Clara's neck and kept it there. "All right," she said quietly. "There you go, you did it." Rourke was kneeling 3 feet away. He looked at the foal, already trying to figure out its legs, already operating on the pure, unreasonable insistence on living that newborn things run on, and then he looked at his wife, who had just spent 3 hours refusing to surrender to an outcome that everyone else in the building had already accepted. "You saved them both," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was watching the foal. "She saved them," Lenora said. "I just helped her figure out how." Word traveled faster this time. By the end of the week, Rourke had received 6 messages from neighboring ranches. A rancher named Hester Weld, a widow, who ran 200 acres north of town with more stubbornness than capital, wrote out personally to say that she had a gelding who'd been diagnosed as incurably lame by everyone who'd looked at him. And she'd heard what Lenora had done with Marsh's horse and Fitch's mare, and would it be possible? Lenora went. She was gone most of the day. When she came back, she told Rourke that the gelding had bone spur development in his left front that had been mismanaged, and that with specific work and a particular kind of supportive shoeing and a 6-month reduction in his workload, the horse had a reasonable chance of being usable again. Hester Weld cried. She wasn't the crying type everyone in the county knew that, so when she did it, it meant something. "She wanted to pay me," Lenora said that evening, setting the table. "What did you say?" I said no. She put the plates down. She argued with me for 10 minutes. "Did you change your mind?" "No." He looked at her. "You're going to have to tell me why eventually." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because the moment I take money for it, it stops being mine." He sat with that for the rest of dinner and didn't push further. It was Hester Weld who first noticed the pattern. She showed up at the Halstead Ranch on a Saturday morning in late August, while Rourke was repairing the paddock fence, and Lenora was in the south pasture, checking the recovering mares. Hester tied her horse at the post and waited for Rourke to notice her, and when he came over, she had a look on her face that he'd learned to associate with news that was bad, but not yet catastrophic. "You hear about the Connolly place?" she asked. He hadn't. "What happened?" "Lost 4 horses over the summer. 2 to some kind of sickness, 2 that just went wrong. Connolly had to sell in April." She paused. "And the Pratt brothers?" "Their stallion died in June. Weird illness, came on fast. They couldn't keep up after that. Sold to a buyer from the east in July." Rourke straightened from the fence. "What buyer?" Hester looked at him steadily. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Because both places sold for well under value, and both of them sold to a man they'd never heard of before. And," she stopped. Started again. "I've been asking around. The Connolly sickness and the Pratt stallion. The timing and the description of how the horses went. It sounds like your horses, Rourke. It sounds a lot like what happened to your animals." Rourke's hand stilled on the fence post. "You're saying someone's been doing this to other ranches," he said. "I'm saying it looks that way. I'm not saying I can prove it." Hester glanced toward the south pasture, where Lenora's figure was just visible against the grass. "Does your wife know anything about this?" Rourke looked at Lenora, too. "I'm starting to think," he said slowly, "that she knows more than she's told me yet." He didn't ask her that evening. He thought about it, sat at the table after supper while she wrote in her notebook, and turned it over from every direction, and decided it wasn't the right moment. Not because he was afraid of the answer, because he wanted to give her the chance to come to it herself, and he had a feeling she was getting closer. He was right. 2 days later, she came to find him at the paddock fence where he was working, and she had the seizure boxes with her. She set it on top of the fence post and put her hands on either side of it and looked at him with the expression of someone who has spent a long time deciding something and has finally gotten to the other side of the decision. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I'm not sure how you're going to take it. Tell me anyway." She opened the box. Inside were journals. 6 of them, at least small, leather-bound, filled edge to edge with careful handwriting in 2 different hands. One set was older, the ink faded to brown in places. The other was newer, darker. "My mother's," she said, touching the older ones. "And mine." She looked at him. "We spent 12 years developing what's in these. Observation techniques, feeding records, treatment methods for horses that were injured, traumatized, malnourished, broken in ways that most people called permanent." She paused. "My mother had a gift for reading horses that I've never seen in anyone else. She could look at an animal and understand what it was experiencing in a way that it wasn't mystical. It was just she paid attention to things other people didn't bother paying attention to. And she passed it to me." She stopped. The afternoon was quiet around them. "She died 4 years ago," Lenora said. "After she was gone, a man named Dacre Bramwell Dacre, a horse dealer out of Pennsylvania, came to offer me employment. He'd heard about what I could do. He wanted to build an elite breeding and rehabilitation operation." She looked down at the journals. "What he actually wanted was to marry me and own these. The knowledge in them, the results they could produce. He understood what they were worth, probably better than I did at the time, and he wanted full control of them." "You refused," Rourke said. "I refused." She closed the box. "He didn't take it well. He started telling people I'd stolen records from his stable. Which wasn't true. These journals are entirely my mother's and mine, developed without him, before I ever met him. But he has money and connections in a very convincing manner," and the story spread. She looked up. "I left Pennsylvania because I had no other choice. I came west because it was far, and because I thought distance would be enough." Rourke looked at the box, then at her. "The contaminated feed," he said. Her jaw tightened. "Dacre has people. I don't know how many or who here. But the contamination, the method, the materials, it's consistent with what I've heard of how he operates when someone doesn't cooperate." She met his eyes. "I heard what Hester Weld told you. The Connolly Ranch. Pratt Brothers. If that's the same pattern, then he's been buying up failing ranches," Rourke said. "After making them fail." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, which was harder than it looked, because she was waiting for something, for the shift in his expression that meant he was calculating the cost of her presence here, the damage she'd brought to his door, the liability of a wife who came packaged with a well-funded enemy, and a secret that had now become his problem. She'd seen that shift before in other faces. She was braced for it. It didn't come. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he said. Not angry, just asking. "Because I was afraid," she said. "That you'd tell me to go." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not going to tell you to go." "Rourke." "I'm not," he said. "That's settled. What I need is to know everything you know about this man, how he operates, and what he's likely to do next." He picked up his tools. "And I need you to stop leaving me half the information and hoping I won't notice the missing half." She almost laughed. It wasn't a fully formed laugh. It was more of a fractured exhale, but it was the closest she'd come to it since she'd arrived. "All right," she said. "Start from the beginning," he said. "I'll make coffee," she told him that evening. All of it, or nearly all, because even in the full telling, there were details she kept back not for deception, but because some things don't have useful language yet, and forcing them into words distorts them. But she told him about her mother and the years of work together. She told him about Dacre's approach, the charm that preceded the control, the way his interest in her had shifted incrementally from professional to possessive, without her recognizing the shift until it was advanced. She told him about the rumors he'd started, the reputation damage, the names of people who had believed him. Rourke listened without interrupting. He did this the way he did most things completely, without performance. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "He's got to know where you are," he said finally. "Yes. So the feed that was a message, or a first move," she said. "To weaken the ranch. Make it easier to acquire." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Dacre doesn't come in directly. He softens the ground first. Then he comes in with an offer when the target is desperate enough to take it. And if the target doesn't take it, she looked at him steadily. He finds another way to make it uncomfortable to stay. Rourke nodded slowly. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the paddock, where the recovering coverings were moving in the early evening light. The foal Dewey had started calling him Chance, which had stuck immediately and irrevocably the way Dewey's names always did, was already showing the gangly, improbable confidence of a young horse who has no idea yet how close he came to not existing. He's going to show up eventually, Rourke said. Personally. Yes, she said. That's usually how it ends. All right. He turned from the window. Then we'll be ready when he does. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man she'd married through letters over 5 months, and had known in person for less than 4 weeks. This rancher, with his scarred forearm and his careful silences and his habit of meaning exactly what he said, and she felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared to name yet. You're not afraid of him, she said. I'm not saying that, Rourke said. I'm saying afraid doesn't change what needs doing. He picked up his coffee. Now tell me everything you know about how he sources his people. If he's been operating in this territory, there'll be someone local. Pulled the cedar box toward her, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Cinder Ridge, Lenora Bellamy opened it at a table with someone else present. The search for Dacre's local contact took 11 days and went nowhere obvious. Cal asked careful questions at the feed supply, which was the logical starting point given the contamination. The supplier, a broad, slow-moving man named Orrin Peck, seemed genuinely bewildered by the questions and produced his delivery records without being asked, which either meant he was innocent or considerably more sophisticated at deception than he appeared. Cal concluded it was probably the former. Dewey, who had an unlikely gift for casual conversation and an equally unlikely network of acquaintances in Cinder Ridge's lesser establishments, spent 3 evenings listening to talk at the saloon without appearing to listen. He brought back the information that a man nobody recognized had been in town 2 weeks before the contamination, asking questions about the Halstead ranch under the pretext of looking for work. Nobody knew his name. Nobody had seen him since. Lenora took that information and sat with it. Meanwhile, the ranch continued. More neighbors came with horses, drawn by the accumulating word of what Lenora had done and was doing. A rancher named Barton Crone arrived with a Mustang that had been so traumatized by its capture and initial handling that it would not allow any human within 20 feet without going completely frantic, rolling eyes, flared nostrils, screaming, throwing itself against whatever contained it. Barton said the horse was useless and probably needed to be put down, but he'd heard about midnight and thought he'd ask before doing it. Rourke looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at the Mustang. Give me a week, she said. She worked with the horse every day. Not dramatically, not with sudden gestures or confrontations, but in the way she worked with all of them, which was slowly and from a distance, and with a patience that Rourke suspected most people would not have been able to sustain. She sat outside the temporary enclosure they'd built for the Mustang in the north paddock. She brought food and set it at increasing proximity to where she sat. She moved only when the horse had settled. She did not approach until the horse stopped retreating. It took 9 days, not 7. On the 9th day, she walked up to the Mustang in the open oak bed and put her hand on his neck, and he stood still. Rourke saw it from across the yard and stopped what he was doing and watched for a moment, and Cal came up beside him, and they both watched together without talking. She's something, Cal said finally. Yeah, Rourke said. You going to tell her that? Rourke picked up his tools. I'm working on it. Cal snorted and went back to the fence. The letter arrived on the 23rd of August. It was addressed to Rourke, which was the first sign that its sender understood exactly what kind of territory he was operating in. A man like Dacre would know that writing to Lenora directly was a threat she could dismiss. Writing to her husband through legal channels was a different species of pressure entirely. The letter was from a lawyer in Helena, and it stated that his client, one Bramwell Dacre of Philadelphia, was prepared to demonstrate in a court of law that certain proprietary breeding and rehabilitation records belonging to his stable had been removed by a former employee, one Lenora Bellamy, now Halstead without authorization. And that said records had significant commercial value, and that his client was prepared to be generous in settlement rather than pursue the matter through formal legal channels, provided the records were returned intact and promptly. The letter used the word generous 3 times. Rourke read it at the kitchen table, then set it down flat and looked at Lenora, who had read it over his shoulder. Her face was the color of old paper. "He's starting," she said. "He's posturing," Rourke said. "There's a difference. Not to a judge if he can get one to listen. Can he get one to listen?" She was quiet for a moment. "He has money. Money makes people listen." Rourke folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'm going to go see a lawyer in Cinder Ridge tomorrow. And I'm going to need you to write down everything you remember about the development of those journals. Dates, locations, everything. Every piece of evidence that puts the work in your hands and your mother's hands before Dacre was ever part of any of it. It's going to take time. Then we start tonight." He stood up. "You're not doing this alone anymore." She looked up at him, and for a moment she was very still, in the way that people are still when something they were not expecting has arrived, and they're not sure yet whether to trust it. "I've been doing it alone for a long time," she said. Not defensively. "Just as a fact, I know," Rourke said. "It's over now." He poured himself more coffee and set a clean sheet of paper on the table in front of her. Lenora looked at the paper. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote the date at the top, a date from 11 years ago. The first summer she and her mother had begun keeping formal records in a stable in western Pennsylvania that no longer existed, and she started at the beginning. And she did not stop until the lantern was almost out, and Rourke's eyes were beginning to close from exhaustion across the table. He didn't leave until she stopped. Outside, midnight moved in his corral in the warm August darkness, his coat gleaming in the light from the stable. A horse that had arrived at this ranch, carrying something that looked like rage, but was really a long unheard plea for someone to simply pay attention. He was eating well now. His movement had changed looser, more even. The wound along his ribs was fully closed and healing clean. Lenora had noticed what no one else had bothered to notice. She had the ability to see what was hidden inside an animal's pain and know exactly what it needed. Question now was whether a man like Dacre would let that ability remain in someone else's hands. And the answer, already riding toward Cinder Ridge from the east, was no. Dacre arrived on a Wednesday. Rourke was at the paddock fence when the buggy came up the road, and he knew before it stopped who was inside. Not because he'd seen Dacre before he hadn't, but because of the way it moved. Too deliberate, too unhurried. The kind of pace that belonged to a man who had decided he owned the road he was traveling on before he'd even gotten to the end of it. The buggy stopped in front of the stable. A man climbed down. He was about 50, with the build of someone who had once been athletic and had since converted that frame into something softer and more expensive looking. Good coat, good boots, the kind of hat that didn't belong anywhere near a working ranch, which was probably intentional. He had a wide, pleasant face, and the particular kind of smile that arrives fully assembled before the person wearing it has decided whether to mean it. Rourke walked over. Cal appeared from the stable doorway. Dewey was somewhere behind them. The man extended his hand like he was greeting an old acquaintance. "You must be Rourke Halstead," he said. "Bramwell Dacre. I believe my lawyer sent you a letter." Rourke looked at the hand, shook it, because refusing to would have given Dacre something to work with, and Rourke wasn't interested in giving this man anything. He did. "Good. I prefer to handle things directly when possible." Dacre looked around the property with the open, assessing curiosity of a man walking through a livestock auction. Fine-looking spread. I imagine it was something in its day. "It's something now," Rourke said. Dacre smiled. "Of course." He looked toward the house. "Is Lenora here? I'd very much like to speak with her." "You can say what you came to say to me." Something moved behind Dacre's eyes. Fast and cold, gone before it fully formed. "Of course," he said again, in a tone that suggested "of course" was a phrase he deployed, when what he meant was, "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I want to resolve this cleanly, Halstead. I have no desire to make trouble for your ranch. I simply want what was taken from me returned. Nothing was taken from you. The records. Those journals were developed by Lenora and her mother over a period of 12 years, Rourke said. before you were any part of their lives. I've got documentation of that, witnessed and recorded with a lawyer in Cinder Ridge. So when you say taken, I'd be careful about what you're claiming and where you claim it. Dacre was quiet for a moment. The pleasant expression didn't leave his face, but it changed quality, became something more deliberate, like a door someone was holding shut with effort. I see she's told you her version, he said. I've seen the evidence, Rourke said. That's different. Dacre looked at him for a long beat. Then he turned and looked at the stable and the paddock beyond it and let his gaze travel slowly across the whole property with an expression that was no longer making any particular effort to seem friendly. You have sick horses, he said. Word travels in this territory. A man in your position, struggling ranch, reduced crew, legal complications, he might find it difficult to rebuild. Is that a threat? It's an observation. Dacre turned back. I'm offering you a way out of a difficult situation, Halstead. Turn the records. Encourage your wife to cooperate. And I'll withdraw the legal claim and ensure the complications your ranch has been experiencing don't continue. Rourke looked at him steadily. Get off my property. The pleasantness dropped entirely for just a moment. It came back, but it took a half-second longer than it should have, and both men noticed the gap. Think carefully, Dacre said. I did, Rourke said. Now get off my land. Dacre climbed back into the buggy with the measured movements of a man who was accustomed to not being rushed, and he drove back down the road at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived at, and Rourke stood watching until the buggy cleared the bend. Cal appeared at his shoulder. Well, Cal said. Yeah, Rourke said. That went well. Rourke turned and walked back to the house. Lenora had watched from the kitchen window. She hadn't come out, not because Rourke had asked her not to, but because she understood, from long experience with Dacre's methods, that her presence would have given him more material to work with. He'd have directed everything at her, drawn the conversation into territory she didn't want Rourke to see her navigating with a man like that. She heard Rourke come inside. She didn't turn from the window. He's going to come back, she said. I know. He doesn't leave when someone says no. He recalibrates. She wrapped her arms around herself. He'll find another angle. Rourke came and stood beside her, looking out at the road. He threatened the ranch, said the complications would continue if we didn't cooperate. She closed her eyes briefly. That's what he does. He makes it your problem until the problem is bigger than your ability to carry it. He mentioned the horse auction, Rourke said. Didn't say it directly, but he mentioned it. Said word travels in the territory. She turned to look at him. The Cinder Ridge horse auction was 3 weeks away. It was the largest event of the season. Ranchers came from 4 counties, buyers from as far as Helena and Billings. It was where reputation got built or destroyed more efficiently than anywhere else in this part of Montana. Because everyone who mattered was in the same place at the same time, and there was nowhere to hide from a public accusation. He's going to do it there, she said. That's what I'm thinking. Pressed her lips together, looked back out the window. He'll bring the legal claim. Make it public. Say it where enough people can hear it that even if it never reaches a courtroom, the damage to your reputation, to the ranch's reputation, is already done. Rourke nodded slowly. So we need to be ready before he gets that chance. How? I'm going to need your help figuring that out, he said. You know him better than I do. It was a simple statement, a direct one. And something about its simplicity, the uncomplicated acknowledgement that she held knowledge he needed, and that he was willing to ask for it without making her feel diminished for having needed to keep it. Hidden landed in a way she wasn't quite prepared for. She turned back to the kitchen table and opened the cedar box. Then, sit down, she said. There's a lot to go through. What followed was 3 weeks of preparation that looked, from the outside, like the ordinary operations of a recovering ranch. Lenora kept working with the horses. More neighbors came. A rancher named Fletcher Sohn brought a horse with mysterious lameness that 3 different people had tried and failed to explain. Lenora watched it move for 20 minutes and said the problem was in the shoulder, not the leg, a deep muscle injury from a fall that had never been properly treated, and told Sohn exactly what to do about it and in what order. Sohn was a skeptic by nature and verified her assessment with a veterinarian who had to ride 40 miles to get there. The veterinarian agreed with Lenora's finding and added that it was an unusually precise diagnosis for someone without formal training. Soane came back and told Lenora this, seeming to expect the compliment to land somewhere meaningful. "Tell me when the horse is better," she said, and went back to what she'd been doing. But behind the ordinary days, things were moving. Rourke had written to contacts in Pennsylvania, a former business associate, the husband of a woman he'd worked with briefly during a cattle drive east 3 years ago, anyone who might have access to information about Dacre's operations there. He'd asked Hester Weld to do the same through her own channels, because Hester had a network of women correspondents across 4 states that made the Postal Service look unsophisticated. And he'd gone back through everything Lenora had written about the journal's development, the dates, the locations, the names of people who had been present when her mother was working, and might remember seeing the work in progress. It was painstaking and frustrating and produced results slowly, but it produced them. Then, in the second week, Hester Weld arrived at the ranch with a letter. Came at mid-morning and found Lenora in the paddock with the Mustang, who had a name now. Having acquired one the same way all the horses on this ranch seemed to acquire names, gradually, and by unanimous informal agreement, becoming Tucker sometime around the end of his second week in the North Paddock. Hester stood at the fence and waited without calling out, because she'd learned by now that interrupting Lenora mid-session with a horse was the kind of thing you did once and then didn't do again. When Lenora came over, Hester held out the letter. It was from a woman named Constance Albright in Philadelphia, a member of Hester's correspondence network, who had connections to the Pennsylvania horse trade. The letter described Dacre's stable operation over the past several years, with the precision of someone who had spent time in proximity to it. Confirmed that Dacre had employed, and then publicly discredited, 2 other women before Lenora, both with knowledge or skills he'd wanted to acquire through marriage or employment, and then claim as his own. Neither of them had the documentation to fight back. One had left the state. The other's name had simply disappeared from the circles she'd previously moved in. Lenora read the letter twice. "He's done this before," she said. "At least twice that Constance knows of," Hester said. "There may be others." Lenora looked at the letter for a long moment. She was not a woman who showed anger in obvious ways it didn't rise to the surface, the way it did with some people, in heat and noise. It went the other direction, compressing into something precise and cold that showed only in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her hands. "Can Constance write this down formally?" she asked. "Statement. Witnessed." "I already asked," Hester said. She said yes. She said she's been waiting for someone to ask. The statement from Constance Albright arrived 8 days before the auction. 2 days after that, a letter came from a man named Elias Vance, who had worked in Dacre's stable as a farrier for 3 years, before leaving under circumstances he described as a mutual and complete agreement to part ways, which was the kind of language that meant neither party wanted to be specific about what had actually happened. Vance's letter was short and direct. It said that during his time at Dacre's stable, he had never seen Dacre demonstrate any meaningful knowledge of horse rehabilitation or breeding development. It said that whatever results Dacre's operation had produced during those years had been produced by Lenora Bellamy, who had been present at the stable as a working horsewoman, and whose techniques and records were visibly and entirely her own. It said he would say this under oath, if asked. Rourke read both letters and looked at Lenora across the table. "We have something," he said. "It might not be enough," she said. "It's more than we had a week ago." She turned the letters over in her hands. "Dacre has lawyers and money, and a story he's been telling for 2 years. We have witnesses who'll write letters but aren't here, and documentation that anyone could claim was fabricated. And you have 12 years of work in those journals that no hired liar could reproduce on demand," Rourke said. "Don't discount that." She looked at him. "Dacre will try to discredit me before I get a chance to demonstrate anything. Then we need people at that auction who've seen the work firsthand," Rourke said. "Marsh, Fitch, Hester, Soane, Barton Crown. If they come, if they bring the horses you worked with, and stand up in public and say what they know Dacre's story has to get through all of them before it lands. Still say it." "Let him say it," Rourke said. "Let him say it in a room full of people who've already watched you work." She was quiet, looking at her hands, looking at the journals which were spread open on the table because she'd been cross-referencing dates when Hester arrived. "He's going to make it ugly," she said. "He's going to say things in front of everyone. I know. About me. About why I left. About things I've never said out loud in this town." Rourke reached across the table and put his hand flat next to hers, without tutting it an offering rather than an imposition. "Tell me what he's going to say. All of it. Before he does." She looked at his hand, then at his face. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "After I refused him the marriage, the whole arrangement, he told everyone in his circle that I'd been his mistress. That I'd stolen from him when he ended things." Her voice was flat, careful. "He told people I was a liar and a thief and a woman with no character, and that the work in the journals was work his stable had paid for, and therefore owned." She stopped, looked back at the table. Most people believed him, because he has a face that's easy to believe. Rourke's hand hadn't moved. "Do you believe any of it?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet when she asked it. "No," he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She looked at him. She was looking for something in his expression, the small shadow of doubt that most people couldn't fully suppress when confronted with that kind of accusation, no matter how much they wanted to. She looked for it the way she looked for the signs of hidden pain in a horse carefully, from experience, without sentimentality. She didn't find it. "All right," she said quietly. "Tell me what else he'll say," Rourke said. "I want to know everything before we walk into that room." Told him. It took most of the evening, and some of it was hard to say, and some of it was hard to hear, but they got through it. By the end, Rourke knew the full shape of what Dacre had done and what he was likely to do, and Lenora knew for the first time since she'd left Pennsylvania that someone else was carrying the weight of it with her. Not carrying it for her, with her. That distinction mattered more than she'd expected it to. The next morning, Rourke rode into town and spent 2 hours talking to the lawyer there, a careful, methodical man named Aldrich Greer, who had been practicing in Cinder Ridge for 20 years, and who listened to the whole story with his hands folded on his desk and his expression revealing nothing. At the end of it, Greer said, "The documentation is stronger than you're giving it credit for. Those journals can be shown to predate any involvement with Dacre, and if you have witnesses who can corroborate that Lenora Bellamy was the originating author, that's not nothing. That's a case. Will it hold up against his lawyers?" Greer was quiet for a moment. "It will hold up against honest ones," he said. "Whether his lawyers are honest is a different question." Rourke nodded. "Can you be at the auction?" "Planning to be," Greer said. "I usually am." 5 days before the auction, something happened that Rourke hadn't anticipated. Dacre moved first, not legally, not yet. He moved socially, which was worse. He arrived in Cinder Ridge and spent 3 days there, staying at the hotel, taking meals at the dining room, attending to whatever business a man of his type attends to in a cattle town, and talking. Quietly, with the specific kind of social precision that comes from long practice at this particular art. By the time Cal came back from a supply run with the news, the damage was already starting. "He's been talking to people," Cal said. "At the hotel, at Prentice's store, at the saloon. Saying your wife stole from him. Saying she's been selling the horses she treats here as if her methods are her own when they belong to his stable." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Who's listening?" "Some, not everybody." "Some." Cal paused. "There's people in town who don't know her yet, who haven't seen what she does. Those are the ones he's working on." Lenora heard this from the kitchen doorway. She'd come in from the stable while Cal was talking and had been standing there for the last 30 seconds without either man noticing. "He's seeding the room before the auction," she said. They both turned. Her expression was controlled, but her hands at her sides had closed slightly. "If enough people hear it enough times before he makes the public accusation," she said, "it sounds like confirmation of something they already suspected rather than a new claim. It's harder to fight." She paused. "He's very good at this part." Cal looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Lenora. "Then we need to move faster," Rourke said. He went to Hester Weld that afternoon. Hester listened to everything, drank her coffee, and said, "I'll make some calls." What Hester's calls produced, over the next 3 days, was something Rourke hadn't specifically planned for, but recognized immediately as valuable, 4 of the ranchers whose horses Lenora had treated went into town themselves and talked. Not as a coordinated campaign, none of them would have agreed to that, and it would have sounded exactly like what it was. But independently, in the natural course of being people who had strong opinions and were not shy about expressing them. Gideon Marsh told anyone who'd listened that Lenora Halstead had diagnosed his horse's problem in 40 minutes, when 2 other people had looked at the same animal and missed it entirely. Aldous Fitch said his breeding mare had delivered a healthy foal after years of failed pregnancies, and he'd rather Lenora Halstead treat his stock than any man who'd ever charged him money for the same work. Hester Weld said nothing specific, but she had a look when Dacre's name came up in conversation that communicated very efficiently that she found the man's credibility wanting, and in Cinder Ridge, Hester Weld's assessment of a person's character carried considerable weight. It wasn't a counter-campaign. It was just the truth, spoken by people who had no reason to lie about it. It helped. Probably not enough, but it helped. The cedar box was open on the kitchen table the night before the auction, when Lenora finally said the thing she'd been not saying for 3 weeks. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said. Rourke was at the counter. He turned around. She was looking at the journals, not at him. "If I'm not here, Dacre's claim collapses. There's nothing to pursue. He wants the knowledge and the records. If I go somewhere he can't follow easily, take the journals. He has no target." "And the ranch?" Rourke said. "You'd still have the ranch. Without me connected to it, his pressure on the property goes away." She closed one of the journals. "I've done this before. Leaving. I know how to do it." The silence in the kitchen was long and complete. "I know," Rourke said finally. She looked up. "I know you've done it before," he said. He crossed to the table and stood on the other side of it from her. "I know it's the thing that makes the most logical sense from where you're standing. They know. I know you've been calculating it for days." He paused. "But I want you to hear something before you decide." She waited. He reached across the table and picked up the nearest journal, the oldest one, his mother's handwriting brown and faded on the first page, and he held it out to her. "These are yours," he said. "Not because I'm telling you they are. Because they were yours before you came here, and they'll be yours after. And nothing Dacre does changes the fact that they came out of your mother's hands, and yours and nobody else's." He set the journal down. "And I don't want your knowledge, Lenora. I don't want your talent or what it produces or what it's worth." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay because this is your home. Because you've spent a month making this place something worth saving. 'Cause Midnight lets you touch his face, and Clara's foal is alive, and Tucker is eating out of your hand in the north paddock. And those things happen because of you, and nobody is going to take credit for them." He stopped, looked at the table for a moment, and when he looked back up, his expression had something in it that wasn't comfortable for him, a visibility he hadn't practiced and wasn't natural at. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you have to stay," he said. "That's not how this works. But I'm telling you that I don't want you to go. And I'm telling you I'll stand next to you tomorrow in that room, and whatever Dacre says, we'll answer it together." He paused. "You don't have to run anymore, if you don't want to." Lenora looked at him across the kitchen table, and the journals and the cedar box, and all the accumulated evidence of the last month, the horses healing in the paddock outside, the foal sleeping in the warm stable, the careful work they'd both done in the days leading to tomorrow, the evenings at this table where he'd poured coffee and stayed until the lantern ran low. She'd been waiting, without fully acknowledging it, for the moment when he'd calculate the cost of her presence against the value of her usefulness, and the numbers would come out wrong. The way they'd come out wrong for her mother eventually, with every man who'd first valued her work and then decided that the work was more interesting to control than the woman doing it. That moment hadn't come. "I've been running for 2 years, she said. Her voice was steady, but something in it was not. "I know," he said. "I'm tired," she said, not performing it. Just saying it plainly, the way you can only say a true thing to someone who won't use it against you. "I know," he said again. She put her hand on the journal her mother had written in. The worn leather cover, the careful handwriting inside that she had read so many times the pages were soft at the edges. "All right," she said. He nodded once. "I'm going to need to sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be bad before it gets better." "Probably," he said. He started for the door, then stopped. Lenora. She looked up. Whatever he says tomorrow. Whatever he accuses you of, in front of however many people. He held her gaze. I already know you. The real version, not his version. The one that spent all night in a stable with a mare nobody else thought was worth saving. He paused. Just wanted you to know that's settled, before we walk in. He went to bed. She sat at the table for a while longer, alone with the journals and the cedar box and the sound of the horses outside. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. She didn't cry now. But she sat for a long time with her hand on her mother's journal, and something moved through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Something that wasn't hope exactly. Because hope implied uncertainty, and what she felt was more grounded than that. It felt like ground, like solid ground after 2 years of moving. The morning of the auction came in gray and close, with low clouds sitting on the hills and the kind of thick August heat that didn't break until late afternoon. Rourke had the wagon ready before sunrise. Cal drove. Dewey sat in the back with 3 horses they were bringing to the auction, 2 of the recovered mares, and a young gelding they'd trained up over the summer, which Lenora had assessed as exceptional enough to bring a genuine price. Lenora was in the wagon seat beside Cal with the cedar box on her lap. She hadn't told him to bring it. She'd decided on her own, sometime between midnight and 4 in the morning, that the journals needed to be present. Whoever disputed her work, whatever Dacre said, the evidence was there, in 12 years of handwriting that preceded him entirely, and she was not going to stand in that room and defend her mother's legacy without the proof of it in her hands. The road into town was already busy at that hour, wagons going the same direction. Ranch hands on horseback. The auction was the largest gathering of the year, and people came from distance for it, which meant that whatever happened today would travel through the territory for months in every direction. Rourke rode alongside the wagon on his bay gelding, and when they came into sight of the auction grounds, the open field south of town, already lined with pens and horses, and the particular controlled chaos of a large livestock gathering, Lenora looked out at the crowd and felt the cold in her stomach that she'd been carrying since yesterday get heavier and more specific. Dacre was already there. He was standing near the main enclosure, with 2 men she didn't recognize, likely lawyers, from the look of their coats and the way they carried themselves, and he was talking to several people she did recognize. Ranchers from the northern counties, men with money and standing who hadn't seen Lenora work and had been in town during the past 3 days when Dacre was doing his quiet preparation. He saw her the moment the wagon rolled in. He didn't move, didn't wave or acknowledge. Just watched her with a small, composed expression that said he'd been waiting, and that waiting hadn't made him uncertain. Rourke appeared at the side of the wagon as she climbed down. He didn't touch her arm or make any gesture of visible support. She hadn't asked for that and didn't need it, but he positioned himself side by side when they turned to face the grounds, which was its own kind of statement. Hester Weld materialized from the crowd on her other side. He's got 2 lawyers with him, Hester said, without greeting or preamble. I've made inquiries. One of them practices in Helena. The other is from out of state. How many of ours are here? Rourke asked. Marsh, Fitchstone, Crown, and the Delaney brothers from the North Ridge, who you probably don't know, but whose horse Lenora looked at 3 weeks ago, and who have opinions. Hester paused. Also, Greer is here. I saw him arrive an hour ago. Lenora looked at the crowd, at Dacre, at the horses moving in the pens. She adjusted the cedar box under her arm. All right, she said. Then Dacre began to walk toward them, and his lawyers walked 2 steps behind him, and the people nearest to them in the crowd began to notice and go quiet in the specific way that crowds go quiet when they sense something is about to happen. And the morning of the auction moved from before into the thing itself. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at Lenora the way a man looks at something he believes he has a legal right to, and his voice when he spoke was pitched just loud enough to carry. Lenora, he said, let's settle this now while we're all here. It's simpler for everyone if it ends today. She looked at him. She had her mother's journal in the cedar box. She had 12 years of work. She had Rourke on her left and Hester on her right and the testimonies of 4 ranchers somewhere in the crowd behind her. And she had the horses. Clara's foal, Tucker in the north paddock, Midnight, who had let her touch his face. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady and clear and carried farther than Dacre's had. "Let's settle it now." The crowd that had gone quiet stayed quiet. That was the thing about a cattle town. People worked hard and talked plenty, but when something real was about to happen, the silence came fast and it came complete. Because everyone understood instinctively that this was the kind of moment you'd be repeating for years, and you didn't want to have missed the beginning of it. Dacre looked at Lenora with the expression of a man who had expected her to flinch and was recalibrating slightly now that she hadn't. It was a small adjustment, barely visible, but she knew his face well enough to read it. "You've been practicing your courage," he said pleasantly. "I've been practicing the truth," she said. "That's different." One of his lawyers, the one from Helena, whose name Lenora would later learn, was Craddock, stepped half a pace forward with a leather satchel under his arm, and the air of a man arriving at the part of a plan he'd already rehearsed. "Mr. Dacre's position is straightforward," Craddock said, loudly enough for the crowd. His stable developed a proprietary system of horse rehabilitation and breeding management over a period of several years. Miss Bellamy, Mrs. Halstead, worked within that system and removed its records when she left his employ. The records are currently in her possession. He wants them returned. Murmuring in the crowd, the kind that isn't agreement or disagreement yet, just the sound of people absorbing information and waiting to see what comes next. Aldrich Greer appeared at the edge of the space that had opened up around the confrontation. He was carrying his own satchel and had the unhurried look of a man who had been in rooms like this before and had learned that arriving at a run never helped anything. "I represent the Halstead family," Greer said, "to no one in particular and everyone present. If we're doing this publicly, I'd like to be part of it." Craddock looked at him. "This is a civil matter betweens." "Then let's have it civilly," Greer said, "in front of witnesses." "Which is apparently what your client wants, so here we are." Dacre raised one hand in a small, tolerant gesture that suggested lawyers were a necessary inconvenience on both sides. "I've always preferred plain talk," he said. "Let me be plain. Lenora, those journals belong to my operation. You know it. I know it. We can do this simply, or we can do it in a way that takes a very long time and costs everyone considerably." He looked at Rourke. "Including your husband and his ranch." Rourke said, "You can direct your comments to me or to Greer. You don't talk to my wife like you're doing her a favor." Dacre looked at him, reconsidered something, looked back at Lenora. "The records," he said. "No," Lenora said. "It wasn't complicated. It wasn't hedged. It landed in the quiet morning air and sat there, simple and complete." Dacre nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he was expecting a particular answer, and is now moving to the next phase of a plan he made well before he arrived. "Then let me tell these people what kind of woman they've been trusting with their horses," he said, and his voice went up just enough to carry clearly to the outer edges of the crowd. "Let me tell them about the woman who came into my stable, took everything I offered: employment, training, access to some of the finest horses in Pennsylvania, and repaid it by removing proprietary records and disappearing west. Let me tell them that the method she's been displaying here, the knowledge she's been trading on it, belongs to work done in my stable, on my property, under my direction." He stopped. "Let that sit for a moment. And let me tell them," he continued, quieter now, that her departure from Philadelphia was not the departure of an honest woman who'd been wronged. It was the departure of a woman who understood she was about to be held accountable. The crowd was very still. Lenora felt Rourke shift slightly beside her. Not toward Dacre, just a small repositioning that put him fractionally closer to her, shoulder nearly at her shoulder. She opened the cedar box. "The first journal," she said, holding it up so the crowd could see it, "was begun in the autumn of 1874. I was 11 years old. My mother wrote the first 43 pages. I began contributing the following spring." She opened the cover to the first page and held it out so that Greer could take it and hold it visible. "Bramwell Dacre's stable was established in 1881. I never set foot on his property until 1885. She looked directly at Dacre. "The mathematics of that are not complicated." Craddock started to say something. Dacre put his hand on the lawyer's arm. "A journal can be dated any way a person chooses," Dacre said, still pleasant. "Doesn't prove No, Gideon Marsh said. He said it from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, and he said it in the flat, carrying voice of a man who is not given to public speeches and means every word of the ones he makes. People turned. Marsh pushed through to the front. He was holding the halter of his quarter horse, the one Lenora had diagnosed in 40 minutes back in July, the one that had been working soundly ever since. I'm going to say something, Marsh announced, to the crowd rather than to Dacre specifically. This woman looked at my horse for 40 minutes. 40 minutes, after 2 other men had been wrong about that same animal for 3 months. She told me exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it, and she was right on both counts. He turned to Dacre. Now you're telling me that knowledge belongs to you. That everything she knows, she learned from you. He looked Dacre up and down with the expression of a man who has spent his life evaluating things and has made his evaluation. You look like a man who's never worked a horse in his life. So I'd like you to explain to me specifically how the knowledge I watched her use on my animal belongs to your operation. Dacre started to answer. Aldous Fitch was already talking. My mare delivered a healthy foal, Fitch said from 2 rows back. After 2 years of failed pregnancies, Lenora Halstead figured out what was wrong inside a single afternoon. Nobody else had. He looked at his neighbors, not at Dacre. I watched her work. She was reading that animal like a book she'd written herself. You don't learn that in someone else's stable. You can't. Dacre's pleasant expression was holding, but it was working harder now. He turned slightly toward the crowd and spread his hands in the gesture of a man who is being very patient with an emotional situation. I understand she's done good work here, he said. I'm not disputing that. I'm disputing who that work belongs to. The methods, the records, the methods, said a voice, and Fletcher Soane walked out of the crowd with the deliberate pace of a man who had planned what he was going to say and was going to say all of it, are in her hands. Literally. I watched her diagnose a shoulder injury through the way my horse moved. Through the way he carried his head. She didn't use any records for that. She used her eyes and her experience and something I couldn't teach a man in 10 years. He stopped in front of Dacre. Where exactly in your stable records does it say how to read what a horse is trying to tell you? Craddock stepped forward again. These testimonials are. True, said Hester Weld, arriving at the front of the crowd with the bearing of a woman who has run 200 acres alone for a decade and has no patience remaining for men who waste her time. They're true, which is the relevant quality. She looked at Dacre with an expression that would have been called withering if Hester had been the withering type. She was more the incinerating type. I've been in correspondence with a woman in Philadelphia named Constance Albright. Who knew your operation, Mr. Dacre? Who knew it well enough to write down in some detail how it actually ran, and who actually produced the results it produced? She reached into her coat and removed a folded letter. She wasn't the only one who wrote. Greer took the letter from Hester and held it alongside the journal. Dacre looked at the letter. Something changed in his face, a very small change, the kind that only happened when a man encountered something he hadn't accounted for in his planning, something that put a crack in the arrangement he'd arrived with. Constance Albright, he said carefully, is a woman with her own reasons too. Elias Vance, Rourke said. Dacre stopped. Rourke reached into his own coat, he'd been carrying it, folded in his inside pocket since they left the ranch that morning, and produced a second letter. Vance worked as your farrier for 3 years. He wrote to me. Says under oath that in 3 years at your stable, he never once saw you develop, direct, or demonstrate any rehabilitation method worth the name. Says the results your operation produced were Lenora's results. Says he watched her work every day, and he knows whose knowledge it was. Rourke handed the letter to Greer. He says he'll say it in a courtroom. The crowd had grown during this. People from the outer edges of the auction grounds had moved inward. The particular gravity of a public confrontation that was going worse than expected, for the man who'd started it was pulling everyone closer. Dacre stood very still. His lawyers were having a quiet, urgent conversation 2 steps behind him. You've prepared, Dacre said. We had time, Rourke said. This doesn't settle the legal question. No, Greer said, in the tone of a lawyer who is enjoying himself moderately, but is too professional to show it fully. But it settles the public one, which is what you came here to win. And I'd suggest, Mr. Dacre, that your position is considerably weaker than it was 20 minutes ago. Dacre looked at Lenora. She looked back at him. She had the cedar box in her hands, closed now, and she held it the way she'd held it since she left Pennsylvania, not clutching it, not hiding it, just holding it. The way you hold something that's yours. The journals, he said, one more time. No, she said, one more time. And then from the direction of the main auction pen, everything went sideways. The horse had been penned with 6 others, waiting for the morning's first auction block. He was a big roan gelding, deep in the chest and wide through the shoulder, the kind of animal that sold well and looked impressive, standing still. But he hadn't been standing still. For the past 10 minutes, he'd been moving in increasingly tight circles in the pen, while the auction handlers watched and debated what to do about it, which was a discussion they'd been having too slowly for too long. Nobody heard the latch on the holding pen give way. What they heard was the sudden metallic crash of the gate hitting the fence post beside it, and then the roan was out, and a man who'd been standing too close went down hard in the dirt, and the crowd scattered the way crowds scatter when a large frightened animal is suddenly moving through them, fast, chaotic, in every direction at once. The roan wasn't charging. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was panicking, which is different and in some ways worse, because a horse that's panicking doesn't have a direction. He goes wherever the fear points him, and the fear was pointing him through the crowd and toward the open ground beyond the auction fence, trailing a broken lead rope and taking out a display table and 2 fence sections on his way. People were yelling. A handler chased and fell back when the horse swung toward him. Another tried to intercept from the left and got clear just in time. The space around the roan widened as people moved back, and the horse found himself in a rough open circle, head high, eyes white-edged, breath coming in hard rhythmic bursts. Dacre looked at the horse, looked at his lawyers. "Get that animal contained," he said, to no one specifically, in the tone of a man who considers disruptions to be other people's problems. One of the handlers raised a coil of rope, started moving toward the roan in a fast, direct approach that was exactly the wrong thing to do with an animal in that state, because a frightened horse that sees something coming at it fast goes one of 2 ways, and neither of them is cooperative. The roan went backward, crashed into the remaining section of fence, and the crowd scrambled again. Lenora had already handed the cedar box to Rourke. He took it without thinking, and then looked at her, and then looked at where she was going. Lenora, she was already moving toward the horse. Not fast, not with the urgency of someone trying to intercept. She walked steadily, unhurried into the open space the crowd had cleared around the roan, and she didn't look at the horse directly when she was still 20 feet away, which was the thing the handler with the rope hadn't understood to do. "Put the rope down," she said to the handler, without raising her voice. He looked at her. "Ma'am, this animal, I know what he is," she said. Put the rope down and stepped back. He looked at the horse, looked at her, stepped back. She stopped at 15 feet. She let the horse see her. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, and her body angled slightly away, not turned from the horse, just not presenting herself as a confrontation, and she waited. The roan snorted hard. His head stayed high, his feet were still moving, small anxious shifts, but he hadn't bolted again. She took 3 slow steps to the left, stopped. The horse's head turned to track her. His feet stilled. She was reading him. She was always reading them. Every second, tracking the shift in his ears, and the angle of his neck, and the pattern of his breathing, and she saw, in the set of his head and the way his weight was distributed, that there was something wrong under the harness. Not old pain, current pain, immediate, something that had been getting worse in that pen, while the handlers debated and the tension in his enclosure built, until the only possible response was out. She moved to the right. The horse tracked her again. "There you are," she said softly. "That's all I needed." She moved toward him, slow, unhurried, with the patience of a woman who has done this so many times in so many stalls, at so many times of day and night, that the fear has been replaced by something that functions like certainty. Not arrogance, she was never arrogant about animals. More like faith. Faith built from practice, which is the only kind that holds. The horse shuddered when she got within 8 feet. Blew out hard. His front feet stamped twice. She stopped. Waited. He didn't bolt. she moved again. At 5 feet, she could see it clearly. The harness had been fitted wrong. A strap on the left side, cutting into a spot that was already inflamed. And every movement in that pen had been working the strap deeper into tissue that was already past the point of tolerance. The horse hadn't been fractious or dangerous. He'd been screaming in the only language available to him, and nobody had been listening. She reached out and put her hand on his neck. The roan trembled under her palm. His head dropped 2 inches. Not enough, not surrender. Not calm, but the first crack in the wall of his terror. And she worked from there, her hand steady on his neck, her voice steady and low. Moving with deliberate care to the harness strap and releasing the buckle and taking the pressure off in one smooth, unhurried motion. The horse exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that comes from the gut, from somewhere deep, when something that has been hurting stops hurting. Long and loose and complete, his head dropped another 3 inches. His feet stopped moving. She stood beside him with her hand on his neck, and he stood there and let her. Crowd had gone completely silent. The handler with the rope had his arms at his sides. The man who'd gone down when the gate broke had gotten back to his feet and was standing with everyone else, watching, a streak of dirt across his chin, not thinking about the dirt. Rourke was holding the cedar box with both hands and not blinking. Hester Weld had her arms crossed and a look on her face that was not surprise, because Hester was rarely so surprised, but was the expression she wore when something confirmed something she'd already believed. Dacre had gone quiet. After a while, 2 minutes, 3, long enough for the animal to stop trembling, Lenora turned to the handler. He needs a different harness. This strap has been rubbing for a while. There's inflammation on the left side, behind the shoulder. It'll need treatment before he works again. The handler took the horse's lead. The roan went with him, as if none of the previous 15 minutes had happened. As if he'd just needed someone to speak his language, which was all he'd ever needed. Lenora turned around. The crowd was still quiet. Not the silence of people who are done, the silence of people who have seen something they know matters, and are still in the process of taking its measure. Dacre was looking at her. The pleasant expression was gone. What was underneath it wasn't anger. Exactly, it was something colder and more honest. The look of a man who has understood that the argument he arrived with no longer exists in the form he built it. She walked back to where Rourke was standing and took the cedar box from his hands. That animal, Dacre said, to the crowd, recovering. That was she has a skill, I've never denied that. That's Elias Vance's letter, Barton Crown said loudly from the edge of the crowd. He'd been quiet until now, holding his Mustang Tucker's predecessor in Lenora's work, a horse that had arrived at the Halstead ranch unable to be approached and was now standing calmly beside its owner in a crowd of 100 people. And I've got my own thing to say. He pushed forward. He was a big, plain-spoken man who didn't use words elegantly but used them honestly, which in this context was more valuable than elegance. I brought her a horse nobody else would touch, Crown said. A Mustang that had been handled so badly he couldn't be in the same space as a person without going to pieces. I came to her because I'd run out of other options, not because I had faith in some mail-order bride. He paused. That horse is standing next to me right now.
You can see it.
He looked at Dacre. Whatever she knows, whatever's in those books, she earned it. It's in her. You can't take what's in a person, and you can't convince me or anyone here who's watched her work that the knowledge belonged to you. Murmuring in the crowd again. Different this time. Not the murmuring of people absorbing a claim, but the murmuring of people who have made up their minds and are saying so to whoever's standing next to them. Greer moved forward. I'd like to present that documentation we've gathered, he said with the formal calm of a man who has waited for exactly this moment. Journal dates cross-referenced with witnesses who knew Lenora Bellamy's work before she had any contact with Mr. Dacre's operation. 2 written statements from individuals with direct knowledge of how Dacre's stable actually functioned. And I'd like to note that we've been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office regarding a pattern of property damage to ranches in this county that precedes acquisition offers from an eastern buyer, a pattern that matches the contamination incident at the Halstead Ranch. Dacre went very still. Craddock leaned close to his client's ear. Rourke said, the Connolly place, the Pratt brothers. Both lost horses to sickness that came on fast, and both sold to a buyer from the east for less than their land was worth. He looked at Dacre without expression. We've been talking to both families, and we've been keeping the grain sample from our own contamination incident, sealed and witnessed. The second lawyer, the one from out of state, took Craddock by the arm, and the two of them had a rapid, quiet conversation that involved several glances in Dacre's direction and a general posture of people revising a plan. Dacre looked at Lenora. She looked at him. "You should have taken the first answer," she said. He looked at the crowd, at the journals in her hands, at the horses that Marsh and Fitch and Crown had brought living, working, healthy evidence of what she'd done in the months since she arrived in Cinder Ridge. At Greer with his documentation, and Hester with her correspondence network, and Rourke with the grain sample, and the patience of a man who doesn't rush toward a fight, but does not back away from one either. He looked at all of it, and the man who had walked into this auction ground, 3 weeks in the making the town seated, the crowd prepared, the lawyers present. The plan fully assembled was now standing in front of the assembled result of everything he'd underestimated, and he was doing the arithmetic. Craddock touched his arm. "Sir, we should—" "I know," Dacre said. He looked at Lenora one last time. The expression on his face was complicated, not defeated exactly, because a man like Dacre didn't do defeat in any straightforward way. It was more like the face of someone who has been forced to move to a longer game and is already thinking about what the next version of this looks like. He didn't get to play a longer game. The territorial marshal's deputy, a broad, quiet man named Garrett, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier and positioned himself at the edge of the crowd without drawing attention, stepped forward now and showed Dacre a document and said something in a low voice that the people nearest to them could partially hear, and the words fraud and property sabotage and multiple complaints filed were among the parts that carried. Dacre looked at the document. Craddock took it and read it, and looked at the second lawyer and said nothing. "I'll need to ask you to come with me," Garrett said. The crowd had gone quiet again, a different quality of quiet now, the kind that happens when something lands that people suspected was coming, but still needed to see arrive. Dacre straightened his coat. He did not look at Lenora again. He walked with Garrett toward the edge of the grounds, with the measured pace of a man who has decided that whatever happens next, he will not be seen to hurry. His lawyers followed. The crowd watched them go. And then someone started talking a low, general resumption of sound, and the auction ground, which had been suspended for the better part of an hour in the particular held-breath state of a public confrontation, began to move and breathe again. The auction proceeded. It felt slightly unreal to both Rourke and Lenora. This returning to the ordinary business of the day, horses moved through the ring, prices called, hands raised after the morning's events. But the horses didn't care about any of it, and neither did the buyers who'd come a long distance for the purpose. So the auction happened the way auctions happen, with all its noise and negotiation and the specific language of men who have been buying and selling animals for long enough that it's become its own dialect. The young Halstead gelding sold for a price that made Cal, sitting in the wagon, remove his hat and look at it. Rourke found Lenora at the fence line of the south pen an hour into the auction, watching the horses move through the ring with the same steady attention she brought to everything. He stood beside her. "How are you doing?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely, which was something she did. She didn't answer questions like that automatically, with whatever was expected. She considered them. "Strange," she said. "I've been expecting that confrontation for 2 years. Now that it's over, I don't quite know what to do with myself." "It might not be entirely over," he said. "Men like Dacre tend to regroup." "I know, but Garrett said the evidence on the property sabotage is strong. The grain sample, and what the Connolly and Pratt families were able to document, that's harder to walk away from than a civil claim about journal ownership." She paused. "He'll have lawyers working on it for a long time. But I don't think he comes back here in person." Rourke nodded. They watched the horses for a while. "Greer wants to formalize the documentation," he said. "Make it official record. Journal dates, the statements, all of it. So there's no future version of this where he tries again." "That's sensible," she said. Marsh appeared at Rourke's shoulder. He looked at Lenora. He was not a man who expressed himself easily in words, and he generally didn't bother trying to. He stuck out his hand. She shook it. That was all. But it was the kind of handshake that meant a thing. Fitch appeared next, and then Soane, and then Barton Crown, and the Delaney brothers that Hester had mentioned, two weathered men in their 60s, who shook hands with the same economy as Marsh and said about the same amount, which was enough. Hester herself appeared last, looked at Lenora with the expression of a woman who has been right about something significant and is too disciplined to say so directly, and said, "Come by next week. I have a mare who's been behaving strangely, and I'd rather have you look at her than anyone else." Lenora said she would come. Hester nodded once and moved off toward the auction ring, already focused on the next thing. Rourke watched her go. "That's about as close as Hester gets to a compliment," he said. "I know," Lenora said. "I'll take it." They stood at the fence for another while. The sun had broken through the morning clouds, and the day had turned warm and clear, the way August days in Fontana sometimes do after a gray start, arriving fully into themselves, as if the earlier weather had been a misunderstanding. "When we get back," Rourke said, "I want to talk to you about the North Stable." She looked at him. "The old one, past the North pasture. Been sitting empty since my father's time." He kept his eyes on the auction ring. "I've been thinking about what it would take to use it. Not for working stock." He paused. "I've watched what you do. The horses people bring. The ones that come in bad shape and leave differently." He turned to look at her. "I think there's something in that. Something bigger than what we've been doing. If you wanted to build it out." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of something?" "A place for horses people have given up on," he said simply. "With somebody who hasn't." She looked at the auction ring. At the horses moving through it, the ones well cared for, the ones not, the ones with the particular held-in quality of animals that have been asked to perform past their ability and are waiting for someone to notice. She looked at the cedar box, which she was still holding. "That would take time," she said, "and resources." "Yes, and it wouldn't be profitable the way a breeding operation would be." "Not immediately. People would bring us horses that they'd already written off," she said. "The difficult ones. The ones that have been handled badly." "Probably," he said. "Is that a problem?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all serious questions. "No," she said. "Those are the ones I know how to help." He nodded. She opened the cedar box briefly and looked at the journals inside her mother's careful handwriting on the oldest pages, her own picking up and continuing. 12 years of accumulated attention to the thing that horses were trying to say when nobody was listening. Closed the box. "All right," she said. "Let's look at the North Stable when we get home." Rourke said nothing, but the look on his face when he turned back toward the auction ring was the look of a man who has gotten more than he asked for and is trying to be quiet about it, which he managed adequately for someone who was not particularly good at being quiet about things that mattered to him. The auction ran until mid-afternoon. They loaded the horses, drove home in the long-angled late summer light, and when they pulled into the Halstead ranch, Midnight was at the fence of his corral watching the wagon come up the road, his black coat catching the evening sun, easy in his body in a way he hadn't been since before anyone could remember. Lenora climbed down from the wagon. Midnight turned his head and watched her walk toward him, put her hand on his neck through the fence. He didn't move away. The North Stable smelled like old wood and dry grass and the particular dusty emptiness of a building that has been closed for a long time but hasn't quite given up on itself. Lenora walked through it the morning after the auction with a lantern in one hand and the practical eye of someone taking inventory rather than making judgments. The structure was sound. Rourke's father had built well, whatever else could be said about him, and the space was larger than it had looked from the outside. 12 stalls, a wide central aisle, good ventilation from the high windows along the east wall. The floor needed work. Several stall doors needed replacing. The water line that had once served the building would need to be reconnected and tested. Rourke stood in the doorway, watching her walk the length of it. "Well," he said. "It's workable," she said. "It'll take a month to get the stalls usable. 2 months before I'd bring a traumatized animal in here. The space needs time to air out, and some of the wood needs replacing before it's safe. I can get Cal and Dewey started on it this week." She turned and looked at him from the far end of the aisle. "Are you certain about this?" It's not going to be a profit operation for a long time. Maybe ever. Fully. I know that. People will bring horses that are going to die here, she said. Not all of them make it. I want you to understand that before we build something around the idea. He nodded. I know. She looked at the stalls, at the high windows letting in the early morning light, at the space that could become something if they were willing to build it slowly and without guarantee. My mother always said the hardest horses to help were the ones that had stopped expecting anything good, she said. The ones that had been hurt so many times they'd made a decision about people and weren't going to revise it. She paused. Those were also the ones she cared most about. Because if you could get through to a horse that had decided if you could show it, that the decision didn't have to be permanent. She stopped, looked at the floor. She said that was the closest she knew to hope made practical. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Sounds like she was something, he said. She was the best person I ever knew, Lenora said, simply and without performance. She was also stubborn past reason, bad at asking for help, and she kept every piece of string she ever found in a tin box in the kitchen for reasons she never explained to anyone. She looked up. She was real. She wasn't a story. No, Rourke said. She wasn't. Lenora walked back toward him down the length of the aisle. All right, she said when she reached him. Let's build something. The legal proceedings against Dacre moved the way legal proceedings move slowly, with long silences between developments and sudden urgencies that resolved into more waiting. Greer managed the Halstead end of it with the steady patience of a man who had been in the territory long enough to know that most things worth having required more time than seemed reasonable. Property sabotage charge was the serious one. The Territorial Marshal's office had been building a case for 3 months before the auction. The Halstead contamination incident had been the most recent and the most documented. But the Connolly family and the surviving Pratt brother had both come forward with accounts of losses that matched the same pattern. And there was a man named Sewell who had done work for Dacre in the territory, and whose whereabouts during the contamination period were difficult to account for, and whose connection to Dacre's operation was detailed and specific. Sewell, when faced with the evidence, made a decision about loyalty that most men in his position eventually make, which was that loyalty to a man with lawyers was not the same as loyalty to a man who would protect you. And the distinction mattered when you were looking at the consequences of what you'd done. Talked. What he said filled 3 days of testimony and implicated Dacre clearly in the deliberate contamination of the Halstead feed supply and in the broader scheme of destabilizing ranches for acquisition. The two families who had lost property got their cases heard. Connelly's recovered some portion of what they'd lost through the settlement proceedings. The Pratt brother got less. These things were never fair in any complete sense, but he got something, and Dacre's ability to operate freely in the territory was finished. Greer brought the news to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the first real cold had come down from the north, and the horses were growing their winter coats, and the north stable had been operational for 6 weeks. It's done, Greer said, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. The civil claim on the journals is withdrawn formally. Dacre's legal team sent the paperwork this morning. Lenora sat across from him. And the criminal proceedings? He'll answer for the sabotage. The extent of it, how much he personally answers for, versus how much gets laid on Sewell that'll play out over time. But his operation in this territory is finished either way. Can't move freely, can't acquire property, can't conduct business here without scrutiny. Greer sipped his coffee. He's a man who operated on the assumption that distance and money would protect him from accountability. That assumption is no longer functioning. Rourke was at the counter. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "What about the other women?" "The ones before Lenora." Greer looked at him. "That's harder. What was done to them was real, but it was done in a different jurisdiction and a long time ago, and the women involved one has moved on, the other's family has declined to pursue anything." He paused. "The world is imperfect in its accounting." "Yes," Lenora said quietly. "It is." She looked at the cedar box on the shelf, where it now lived not locked, not hidden. Just there, on the kitchen shelf next to her mother's tin of saved string, which she had found in the bottom of her bag when she arrived, and had kept because some things you keep without needing to explain why. "Thank you," she said to Greer, "for all of it. Greer waved it off in the way of a man who is professionally uncomfortable with gratitude. "Do good work," he said. "That's thanks enough." He finished his coffee and left, and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the north stable was full of horses that needed attention, and the world was imperfect in its accounting but was, on this particular Thursday, as settled as it was going to get. The first winter, at the Halstead Horse Recovery Ranch, which was what people in the county had started calling it, informally, without anyone deciding to was hard in the specific ways that Montana winters are hard, which is to say relentlessly and without apology. 4 horses came in during those months. 2 were horses that ranchers had simply run out of ability care for and brought to Lenora because they'd heard she would take them and try. One was a young Mustang that had been in a pen north of town with a leg injury that had gone untreated for too long. Hesterweld had found it and sent word, and Rourke had driven out in a snowstorm to bring the animal back. The fourth was a mare that a rancher named Duckett had brought himself in December, holding his hat and not quite meeting Lenora's eyes when he explained that he'd handled the horse badly for 2 years and wanted to know if any of it could be undone. She looked at the mare for a long time. Then she looked at Duckett. "Probably," she said. "It depends on how long you're willing to wait for it." "As long as it takes," he said. She took the mare. Of the 4 that came in that winter, 3 recovered to the point of being usable animals again. The 4th, the Mustang with the leg, did not make it past February. He died on a cold night with Lenora beside him, and she came in after and sat at the kitchen table without her coat for a long time before Rourke realized she was cold and brought it to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I knew he probably wouldn't," she said. "The injury was too old. I just wanted him to have the time without pain at the end." He sat with her for a while. He didn't try to improve the situation with words, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on, his understanding that some things didn't need improvement, just company. "Duckett's mare is eating better," she said eventually. "I noticed. She let me brush her today without moving away." She wrapped her hands around her coffee. "That's the first time." He nodded. They sat in the cold kitchen until it warmed up, and outside the wind moved through the north pasture, and the horses they were responsible for were in from the cold, and the night was the night. Spring came slowly, and then all at once, the way Montana spring does, like a door that's been stuck and then opens completely. Chance Clara's foal, now a yearling, was growing into a horse of considerable promise. He had his mother's solid frame and something extra in his movement that made ranchers stop and look twice when they saw him in the paddock. Dewey had taken a proprietary interest in his development that was entirely unofficial and completely absolute, and nobody mentioned this because it was clearly important to Dewey in a way that went beyond the professional. Midnight was a different horse than the one Lenora had found in that corral 8 months ago. Not tamed, that was the wrong word for what had happened, because taming implies something broken down. He was understood. There was a difference. He worked well now, moved with the confidence of an animal that had been heard and had stopped needing to scream about it, and several ranchers had expressed serious interest in him as a breeding stallion, which was a thing that would have been incomprehensible a year ago. Lenora hadn't decided about that yet. She took her time with decisions about the horses. Rourke had learned to give her the time. The ranch was not prosperous in any dramatic sense. They were stable, genuinely stable, for the first time since Rourke had taken over from his father, with the breeding operation running cleanly under Lenora's management of the mare's health and cycles, and the recovery operation beginning to build a reputation that brought in horses, and occasionally, carefully, kind of compensation that Lenora had stopped refusing once she understood that taking money for the work was not the same as surrendering ownership of it. That understanding had taken most of the winter to arrive, and had arrived quietly, without announcement, in the way that real understanding usually does. She still didn't charge the ranchers who couldn't afford it. Rourke didn't push her on that. It was the kind of thing that was also the work, and he understood that. Cal had stayed. He'd had an offer from a larger ranch to the south in January, and had turned it down and not mentioned either the offer or the refusal to anyone, and Rourke only found out through Hester's information network 3 months later. When he brought it up, Cal said, "It's a good place now," in the tone of a man who considered the matter settled and was not interested in further discussion. Dewey had become, in the way of young men who find their place. Someone recognizably different from the nervous, twice self-introducing boy who'd met Lenora's stagecoach the previous June. He was still young. He was still dewy. But he could approach Midnight's corral with easy confidence, could assist with a difficult foaling without being told twice, and had developed under Lenora's patient instruction a genuine ability to read horses that would serve him for the rest of his working life. He didn't know yet that it was something he'd been taught. He thought it was something he'd learned, which was, in Lenora's understanding of how teaching worked, exactly the goal. Hester Weld came by the ranch on a morning in April to look at what had been done with the north stable and walked its length twice in silence before saying, "You should take on an apprentice." Lenora was cleaning a hoof at the far end of the aisle. "I have Dewey. Dewey works this ranch," Hester said. "I mean someone who comes specifically to learn. Someone young enough that what you teach them will have time to become something." She paused. "There are young women in this county who want to work with horses, and nobody will teach them anything, and nobody will teach them anything because they're not men. I know 2 of them personally." Lenora looked up from the hoof. Hester was standing, with her arms folded, in the posture she used when she'd already decided something and was presenting it rather than proposing it. "That's not a small undertaking," Lenora said. "No," Hester agreed. "But you're not a small person." Lenora let that sit for a moment. Then she went back to the hoof. "Send them by," she said. "I'll see what they know and what they're willing to learn." Hester unfolded her arms. "I'll have them here next week." She left, and Lenora finished the hoof and thought about her mother showing her how to do exactly what she'd just done in a stable in Pennsylvania in the early spring. When she was 7 years old, and the world had seemed entirely made of horses and the knowledge of them, she thought about what it meant to pass something on. Not in theory, she'd thought about that plenty, but in practice. The actual weight of it, what it required from the person doing the passing, and what it gave to the person receiving. Her mother had never thought of the knowledge as a possession, had never treated it as something to be protected or hoarded or leveraged. It was more like a river, the way she'd talked about it. It came from somewhere and it went somewhere, and you were responsible for keeping it moving. Lenora had spent 2 years protecting the journals as if they were the thing itself, as if the knowledge lived in the leathers, rather than in the work, in the hours, in the hands that held a frightened animal and waited without agenda for as long as it took. The journals were the record. They were not the knowledge. The knowledge was something you gave away and had more of, not less. Summer came and the north stable was full. Not always with horses on their way to recovery sometimes, with horses that weren't going to recover, who needed the time anyway, who deserved to have someone nearby, who understood what they were going through even if they couldn't be fixed. Lenora made those distinctions carefully and without sentiment, which was different from without feeling. She felt everything that happened in that stable. She simply didn't confuse feeling it with being able to change it. 2 young women Hester had sent one named Rosa, 17, who had grown up on a sheep farm and had more raw instinct with animals than most people developed in a lifetime, and one named Petra, 20, who had less instinct but more patience than anyone Lenora had ever worked with, and a capacity for sustained attention that was genuinely rare, came every day, and worked and learned, and sometimes got things wrong, and were corrected without ceremony, and kept working. Rosa, within 3 months, could read the early signs of colic before the horse showed obvious symptoms. Petra could handle a difficult farriery situation with a nervous horse better than Cal, which Cal acknowledged without visible distress because Cal was a practical man who respected competence regardless of where it lived. They were not Lenora. They were themselves, learning a version of what Lenora knew that would become their own version, different in the specific ways that any knowledge changes when it passes through a new person. That was correct. That was the point. Rourke watched this and thought things he didn't always say. He was good at thinking things he didn't say, but he was getting, slowly, less good at it in the specific context of his wife, because she had a way of being present that made silence feel less protective than it used to. One evening in late summer, they were sitting on the porch after supper, a thing they'd started doing in May without deciding to, which had become a habit without either of them remarking on it, and he said, "I want to talk to you about something." She was watching the horses in the near paddock, the way she always watched horses when they were nearby, even when she was ostensibly not working. It was not surveillance. It was more like the way some people listen to music, a background attention that was always present. "All right," she said. "I think you should write it down," he said. "What you know. Not just in the journals that's a record. I mean something meant to be read. Something that could be used by other people, people who might not have the chance to learn from you directly." He paused. "What your mother knew and what you developed. The observation methods. The handling approaches. The way you think about a frightened horse." He looked at her. "It should exist somewhere that's harder to lose than a cedar box." She was quiet for a while. "That's a bigger thing than you're making it sound," she said. "I know. I'm not saying this week. I'm saying at some point. As part of what this place is." She looked at the paddock. At midnight, who was grazing in the long evening light, moving slowly through the grass with the ease of a horse that had stopped carrying something it wasn't meant to carry. "My mother never thought what she knew was important enough to explain formally," she said. "She thought it was just paying attention. She thought anyone could do it if they slowed down enough." Could they? Lenora considered this honestly. "Some of it," she said. "The instinct part that's harder, but the foundation of it. The way you approach an animal that's in pain. The way you learn to look for what's hidden rather than what's obvious." She paused. "My mother was wrong about it being obvious. She was too close to it to see that it wasn't obvious at all. That she was doing something rare, and she'd made it look ordinary through years of practice." "Then write it down," Rourke said. "So the next person doesn't have to start from nothing." She looked at him in the evening light, this man with his scarred forearm and his practical kindness, and his habit of seeing clearly what the people around him needed before they'd fully articulated it to themselves. "You're a difficult person to argue with," she said. "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm just saying what makes sense." She almost smiled. "That's what makes it difficult." Picked up his coffee. She looked back at the horses. "All right," she said. "I'll write it down." The years that followed were not a story in any tidy sense. They were years which meant they contained difficulty and setback alongside the things that worked. Horses that didn't make it. Winters that hit harder than expected. A spring when the creek flooded and took out the south fence, and they spent 2 weeks doing nothing but repairs and were short-tempered with each other in the specific way of people who are tired and who care about what they're doing, and have run low on the grace that caring requires. There was an autumn when a rancher brought a lawsuit claiming that a horse he'd sent to the recovery ranch had been damaged by improper treatment, a claim that was false and was eventually proven false, but which cost them 3 months of anxiety and Greer's fees, and a period during which Lenora woke at 3 in the morning more often than she slept through. Rourke learned, during those months, that the thing she needed from him in the worst moments was not reassurance. She'd long since stopped trusting easy reassurance, but simply his presence, plainly and without agenda, which was something he could give without pretending anything was simpler than it was. The lawsuit was dismissed. The rancher who'd filed it was not, in the end, believed. The recovery ranch continued. Rosa stayed and became, in time, someone the county sent for when there was a horse nobody else could reach. She had her own way of doing it different from Lenora's, informed by it but not imitative of it, and Lenora watched her work sometimes with the specific pride of a person who has contributed to something that now belongs entirely to someone else, which is the best possible outcome of teaching. Petra eventually moved north to a larger operation, taking what she'd learned with her, and wrote back regularly for years. Her letters were detailed and specific about horses, and asked useful questions and contained, occasionally, the kind of observation about an animal she'd been working with that made Lenora read them twice and think about them for days. Chance, Clara's foal, born on that long, desperate night in the stable, grew into what his early movement had promised. He was sound and smart, and had a quality that experienced horsemen recognized and couldn't always name, which was a kind of willingness, an absence of the defensive tension that lives in horses, who've been handled without patience. He'd been born into a place where someone cared how horses were treated, and it showed in everything about him. Duckett's mare, the one he'd brought in December, with 2 years of bad handling behind her, eventually became one of the steadiest working horses in the county. Duckett brought her back to visit once, which was the kind of thing that didn't happen between ranchers and ranch horses, and which nobody commented on directly. Midnight remained at the Halstead Ranch. The decision about whether to stand him as a breeding stallion had been made gradually, in the way good decisions often are, through a series of smaller decisions that accumulated into a direction. He worked with select mares from neighboring ranches, and the foals he produced had his quality without his history horses that hadn't needed to survive the same damage before someone paid attention. That was the inheritance he passed on, not the scars, just the quality beneath them. On a morning in the autumn of the 4th year, Rourke came out to the corral and found Lenora there with their daughter. The girl was 3 years old, with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubbornness, which had already manifested in ways that were both exhausting and, in their more honest moments, deeply familiar to both her parents. Her name was Mara, which had been Lenora's mother's middle name, and she had an interest in the horses that had been present from the time she was old enough to pull herself up on fence rails and look over them. She was sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside the corral fence, and she was holding one of Midnight's front hooves in her small hands, and Lenora was crouched beside her, showing her something about the underside of the hoof, some detail of how to look and what to look for. Rourke stopped where he was. He watched his wife, who had arrived in Cinder Ridge 3 years ago, with a locked cedar box and a face that gave nothing away, and 2 years of running behind her, crouched in the dirt beside their daughter, passing something on. Not performing it, not making it ceremonial, just doing it the way her mother had done it for her, in the ordinary way of knowledge that moves from one person to the next, when someone cares enough to stay still long enough to share it. Mara said something he couldn't hear from where he stood. Lenora answered her. He couldn't hear that either. Mara looked at the hoof very seriously, with the full-face concentration of a 3-year-old encountering something important, and then she looked up at her mother and said something else. Lenora laughed. It was a full laugh, not the fractured exhale that had been the closest she'd come to it when she first arrived, but an actual laugh, with her head tipped back slightly, surprised out of her by whatever Mara had said. It was the laugh of someone who had stopped being careful about laughing, which takes time and specific conditions to arrive at. Rourke stood at the edge of the yard and watched it. He thought about the morning she'd arrived on that stagecoach, the locked box, the careful eyes, the woman who had looked at every horse they passed, with the concentration of someone who trusted animals more than people, and had good reasons for that. He thought about the night in the stable when she'd named exactly what Midnight needed, before anyone else had stopped to ask. He thought about the kitchen table with the lantern burning low and the journals spread open between them and the weight she'd been carrying alone. For 2 years, finally shared, imperfectly, and not all at once. The way things actually get shared between real people. He'd been a man with a failing ranch and a desperation he hadn't admitted to anyone, and a history of being too proud to ask for help until the asking became unavoidable. She'd been a woman with a locked box, and a gift she'd nearly let fear turn into a secret she kept until it killed her. They'd been, separately, exactly as incomplete as two people could be. The cedar box was on the kitchen shelf. Open. It had been open for 2 years. The journals were in it and beside it, and in the small room off the kitchen, where Lenora worked in the evenings, some of them. Increasingly, in the process of being transcribed into the larger, cleaner document that Rourke had asked her to write, which she'd been working on slowly, and which was growing into something more than either of them had imagined when he first suggested it. There was a truth in what they'd built that Rourke had thought about from many angles and kept arriving at the same way. It wasn't the truth that a ranch could be saved by the right person arriving at the right time, although that had happened. It wasn't the truth that knowledge was worth protecting, although it was. It was something simpler and harder than either of those things. A frightened creature, horse, or person that has decided the world is dangerous, and people are the cause of the danger is not wrong, exactly. It arrived at that decision through evidence. The evidence was real. The fear was earned. What changes it isn't argument, isn't force, isn't even kindness, entirely, because kindness can be performed and the frightened know the difference between performed and real. What changes it is time and consistency, and someone who doesn't need the fear to end on their schedule. Someone patient enough to let the creature decide for itself when the evidence has changed. Lenora had known that about horses since she was 7 years old, sitting in a stable with her mother, watching an animal come slowly back to itself. She'd spent 2 years forgetting she knew it about people. She remembered now. Mara had gotten to her feet and was trying to lead Midnight by his halter along the fence line, which the horse was tolerating with the elaborate patience of an animal that has decided this small person's is not a threat and is also not going anywhere, so he might as well cooperate. Lenora was walking beside them with her hand barely touching the lead rope, ready but not intervening. She looked up and saw Rourke. She didn't wave or call out. She just looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not complicated. That was, in fact, among the least complicated expressions he'd ever seen on her face, which had spent so much of the time he'd known it working to give nothing away. He raised a hand. She turned back to Mara and Midnight and the slow, slightly negotiated progress along the fence line. He went back to what he'd been doing, which was the fence on the east side that needed new posts before winter came down hard, and the work was ordinary and necessary and good. And the sounds of the ranch around him were the sounds of a place that was alive and purposeful and imperfect and continuing. That afternoon, a rancher from 15 miles north showed up with a horse he said was useless and probably past saving. And Lenora came out of the north stable where she'd been working and looked at the horse for a long moment and said, "Leave him with me for a month." The rancher said he didn't know if it was worth the cost. She said, "Let me worry about that." He left the horse. She went back into the stable. There are people who move through the world looking for what is broken in order to avoid it. And there are people who move through the world looking for what is broken because they know what to do about it. The first kind of person lives more comfortably. The second kind of person builds something that lasts past them. Lenora Bellamy, who had arrived in Cinder Ridge as a mail-order bride, hiding everything that made her who she was, who had spent 2 years believing her knowledge was a thing that made her a target rather than a person, who had slowly and imperfectly, and without any guarantee of outcome decided to stop running, stood in the north stable of the Halstead Ranch in the amber October light and began to work. She was not a woman who had found an easy life. She had found a true one, which is not the same thing and is, for people built the way she was built, considerably better. Outside, Mara was still at the fence, talking to Midnight in the serious, fully committed way of small children who are not yet aware that horses can't understand the specific words. The horse stood there and listened, which was in the end how everything on that ranch had started. Someone stopped. Someone paid attention. Someone decided that the animal on the other side of the fence, whatever it had been through, was worth the patience. And the patience, given freely and without deadline, had turned out to be enough.